What's up, fans? My name is Brian, and you're watching Rosa's Trains. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I'm a super big fan of O-gauge electric toy trains. But some of you may be asking me why I love O-gauge so much. Well, as I wrote on the Rosa's Trains website, I wanted a toy that isn't too big like G-gauge, but not too small like HO or N-scale. So, I ultimately decided that O-gauge is just the right size for my taste. While this scale does have 2-rail track, as do all other sizes, it is not uncommon to see a 3-rail track system, especially in the United States. Yes, I know a lot of you are going to say it's awkward and unprototypical, but it's not always a bad thing. 3-rail track does have several electrical advantages over 2-rail track, as well as the former's out-of-scale rail height. Also called high rail, this system allows a user to easily place the train on the track due to the thicker wheel flanges attached to locomotives and railroad cars. Most importantly, it is much less vulnerable to derailments than scale rail track. Because a lot of O-scale trains typically require wider radius curves for satisfactory operation, space is a big problem for many homeowners. Fortunately, the alternative is to run some of the shorter and less expensive engines and cars that can negotiate tight turns on small, toyish layouts, albeit with less realism. And that's exactly what I prefer at home. As most of you know, Lionel, MTH, and Atlas are the best known manufacturers of O-gauge trains. When it comes to locomotive types, O-scale has a very nice variety of steam, diesel, and electric engines, but not quite as wide as HO scale, which is considered the #1 most popular model railroad size in North America. For that reason, I have created this video to feature the top 12 diesel locomotives that deserve to become O-scale models, and I mean those that are currently not available as such. Now, for those of you who prefer steam engines, I can't decide any of them this time around. There are unquestionably so many types of steamers in O-gauge, and that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. Yet there are some of the more obscure diesels in the same scale, like the Alco DL109 and the Lima Hamilton LT2500 transfer unit. Even so, it would be nice to introduce some more types for O-gauge, instead of just offering the same engines every year, like the EMD SD70ACe and the GE ES44AC. I'm not saying that I dislike either of them. They're absolutely great sellers, but they can sometimes be boring to look at. Now, I'm sure some of you may disagree with what diesels I'm going to mention concerning the likelihood of whether it's being made for O-scale. It's understandable that a new tooling for a particular model can cost thousands of dollars to build, but never say never. There's always an opportunity to introduce a new locomotive that hasn't joined the O-gauge world before. You know this is my channel, and I reserve the right to choose whatever engine I want, whether you like it or not, to list for this video, so please be respectful. With our true love of trains, anything is possible, and I hope you all agree with that. I originally thought about doing the top 10 locomotives, but decided to list 12 of them because there's so many interesting diesels that have existed over the years. I also considered ranking them from least to most likely to become O-scale models, but I think that would be too difficult. So I'm going to instead list them chronologically in the order of their build years. I will explain the brief history of each locomotive and why I believe they should be made for 3-rail O-gauge. As usual, I do have a disclaimer whenever I come up with any list of things. This video will not include the following: rebuilt units, slug units, and foreign locomotives outside of North America, even some engines built in the US for overseas export. Anyway, if you love O-scale trains, then join me as we cover the top 12 diesels that are worthy of modeling. Let's get started. Number 1. General Electric Universal Series U-18B. This locomotive is known to be the only North American U-boat equipped with an 8-cylinder diesel engine, producing up to 1,800 horsepower. As such, the 4-axle U-18 is the smallest of all domestic GE U-boats and is also affectionately nicknamed the Baby Boat. Because of its little size, it was intended to pull short freight trains on branch lines rather than long distances. The U-18 might not be the most successful diesel, but I believe it's one of the cutest GE locomotives ever built, albeit with its growling 4-cycle 7 FDL prime mover. Another diesel that is similar in size to the U-18B is the 1,500 horsepower GP15, built by General Motors' Electromotive division. Atlas has offered an O-scale model of the GP15, the most recent of which is equipped with ProtoSound 3.0 and the MTH digital command system. I imagine this would be better than the previous versions, featuring the out-of-date Lionel Trainmaster command control system and rail sounds. As for the GE U-18, I've only seen an HO scale model of it, manufactured by Intermountain Railway Company. With that being said, maybe Atlas should make this engine an O scale. It will certainly negotiate tight curves on small train layouts. What do you think? Number 2. Montreal Locomotive Works M420, the very first diesel featuring the Canadian Comfort Cab, or North American Safety Cab. The M420 was technically built a few weeks before General Motors' diesel division introduced its own Comfort Cab unit, the GP38-2W, although the latter once wore a banner commemorating the first locomotive with new safety cab design. The two major purchasers of the M420 were Canadian National and the British Columbia Railway. The latter also bought 8 cabless M420B booster units. A similar variant, called the M420R, was introduced, 5 of which were delivered to the Providence and Worcester Railroad in the northeastern United States. Rapido Trains, a Canadian brand, has made an HO scale model of the M420 in liveries of original buyers, as well as a few second-hand owners. It's no surprise that Rapido offers a lot of Canadian locomotive types like this one. Still, it would be cool to see the earliest Comfort Cab diesel in O gauge, eh? Number 3. GE P30CH, aka the Pooch. This is the first locomotive in my list that was built only for a single railroad, in this case, Amtrak. I have seen some O-scale models based on those that were delivered solely to one railroad. For example, the 4884 Big Boys, the gas turbines, and the DDA 40X diesels were all built exclusively for Union Pacific. In recent years, though, these models have been delivered in fantasy paint schemes, in addition to the more prototypical schemes. Anyway, the P30CH was the second diesel locomotive purchased new by Amtrak. You probably remember that the agency's very first new locomotive was the Electromotive SDP40F, which was mechanically derived from the popular SD40-2 and had a full-width cowl body resembling the FP45. This allowed the SDP40F an easy conversion to freight duty should Amtrak be discontinued for any reason. General Electric, however, agreed to build a unique passenger locomotive based on the freight duty U-30C at the request of the agency. The Pooch was also the first to be equipped with all electrical head-end power instead of a steam generator, as Amtrak took delivery of the tubular Amfleet passenger cars, which could otherwise not accept steam from older locomotives or the ill-fated SDP-40F. The GE P30 helped eliminate the need for separate head-end power generator cars that were coupled to diesels using steam lines. Unfortunately, the Pooch was not without its mechanical flaws that led to uncomfortable working conditions for the crews, but it was fairly safer and spent more years in service than the derailment-prone SDP-40F. It wasn't too long before Amtrak received the first of the extremely successful F40PH diesels from EMD in 1976, and the P30s were eventually retired by the early 90s. Sadly, none of these big puppies survived. Although Amtrak was the only purchaser of the Pooch, the units had been repainted from the railroad's Phase 2 scheme to Phase 3. I have not seen the P30 officially in HO scale, but that would be awesome for those of you who preferred that size. Somebody made a 3D printed model of this engine in Amtrak's Phase 5 paint, as well as ditch lights and air conditioning units. Neat. Imagine the Pooch as your next O-gauge diesel. Number 4. 4-axle GE-7 series. I'm going to place 3 major types in one slot: B23-7, B30, and B36, along with their respective variants. The Dash 7, or Series 7, is perhaps the most underappreciated locomotive product line from GE, but its purpose was to supplant the Universal Series as well as to compete with the EMD-2 diesels in the 1970s and 80s. By that point, more advanced electronic modules became widely available, especially for the railroad industry. Most importantly, the Dash 7 helped enthrone GE as the #1 diesel locomotive builder by 1983. One of the major differences between a U-boat and a Dash 7 is that the rear radiator wings are standard on the latter, although some universal models, i.e. the U-33 and U-36, had them. However, a more significant difference on the successor is a slightly wider area between the engine hood and the radiator section. This is the new location for an oil cooler. The B23-7 used a 12-cylinder diesel engine, while the B30 and B36 use a 16-cylinder engine. Other variants include the family line's BQ23-7 with a cube-shaped cab for crew quarters, hence the letter Q, and the B30-7A, which can produce up to 3,000 horsepower with the more fuel-efficient V12 instead of the V16. Additionally, the Burlington Northern Railroad ordered a fleet of cabless booster units designated as the B30-7AB. Meanwhile, the Southern Railway bought the B23s, B30As, and B36s, all built with high noses. So, have there been any GE-7 locomotives in O-scale? Well, I have seen the 6-axle C30-7 made by MTH. In fact, I do have a CSX version in my collection, but there's no 4-axle-7 for some reason. For HO scale, there are quite a few examples, like the B36 from Rapido. It's a very well detailed model, especially with railroad-specific features, such as the southern high nose, various headlight locations, etc. If you ask me, I think my personal favorite B36 is in the Seaboard system scheme. Something tells me that the Dash 7 was no stranger to intermodal traffic, including the double-stack well cars. It would be cool to see a Seaboard B36 with a set of Sealand container cars in O gauge. What about the BQ-23? In reality, only 10 units were built for the Seaboard coastline and painted in the Family Lines livery. These were later repainted by the Seaboard system, and finally CSX. But what if the BQ-23 were dressed in the colors of the Chessie system? That would be so cute. Overall, I would love to see any 4-axle Dash 7 locomotive in O-scale, whether as prototypical models or painted in fantasy schemes. Number 5. General Motors Diesel Division Draper Tapers. Again, I'm going to place 3 locomotives in this slot: SD40-2F, SD50F, and SD60F. They're not just any cowl units, but they all have one important feature. The term Draper Taper refers to the area that is tapered between the comfort cab and the engine compartment, allowing for rear view window on both sides of the locomotive. This design was created by William Draper, Canadian National Railway's Chief of Motive Power. The very first Draper Taper locomotive was the HR 616, built by Bombardier in 1982. 3 years later, General Motors introduced its own cowl unit, the SD50F. However, due to its problems with the 645F diesel engine, it was soon succeeded by the SD60F with the more reliable 710G prime mover. Notice the classification lights and number boards relocated from the top of the SD50F's windshield to the nose of the SD60F. In 1988, the Canadian Pacific Railway placed an order for 25 SD40-2F units. Unlike the CN SD50 and 60F, the CP units had 3 glass panes on the windshield instead of 4. Also note the side door moved from the cab to the tapered portion of the locomotive. When it comes to paint schemes, all the SD50 and 60F units were delivered to Canadian National in the black and white zebra stripes. Although some were repainted in later phases, CN retired the whole SD50 fleet in 2008, a few units of which found new life on 2 smaller railroads, the Dakota, Missouri Valley and Western Railroad, and the Montana Limestone Company. Likewise, Canadian Pacific retired its SD40-2F fleet in 2016, but some were sold to the Central Maine and Quebec Railway and were repainted in blue and silver. One unit was also repainted as a heritage locomotive in honor of the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad. However, CP made the decision to purchase the CM&Q in 2020 and thus reacquired the remaining SD40-2Fs. What a funny disposition. I love learning oddities like that. After returning to CP, one of them was rebuilt into the zero-emissions hydrogen fuel cell locomotive designated as the H20EL. I remember seeing an HO scale model of the SD40-2F made by the Bowser Manufacturing Company, which is based in Montoursville, Pennsylvania. While making this video, I also recently found out that there is an HO scale SD50F and SD60F by Aurora Miniatures of Scarborough, Ontario. Interestingly, the company was founded in 2020, so this is a very young business. If all the GMD Draper Tapers become O-gauge models, there will be quite a few paint scheme phases, from the CN zebra stripes and CP red barns, to the blue barns of the CM&Q, to hydrogen power. They are so freaking cool. Number 6. Electromotive F59PH. a modern Canadian-designed commuter rail diesel locomotive. Go Transit, a Toronto-based agency, needed a more technologically advanced locomotive to replace the GP40s, F40s, and the auxiliary power units that were repurposed from vintage F units. In 1988, General Motors' diesel division responded by engineering a type that would produce 3,000 traction horsepower with a 12-cylinder prime mover while using an independent engine for head-end power. This is a quieter and more efficient method than having to use the main engine for the train's electricity, which is common on the F40 PH, although a few F40s do have an auxiliary engine for the same purpose. The F59 PH uses the same mechanical components as the freight-duty GP59, with the addition of the wide nose, a full-width cowl body, and of course, the head-end power generator set. The second customer of this locomotive was the Los Angeles area Metrolink commuter rail system. These units were delivered between 1992 and 1993. More paint schemes came into existence as some F59s were later sold to second-hand owners, including the Dallas-Fort Worth area Trinity Railway Express, North Carolina Department of Transportation, and the Chicago area Metro system. In 1994, General Motors designed a more streamlined version called the F59 PHI, which turned out to be a better seller than its predecessor. While there is no O-scale model of the original F59, I have seen a lot of the F59 PHI locomotives from MTH. However, Rapido has made the older F59 in HO scale, as well as N scale, available in both prototypical and fantasy schemes. I never thought of this locomotive in a Caltrain or Tri-Rail livery. Very interesting. Now, I've heard from an online source that the Santa Fe Railway proposed a GP60 variant with a full-width cowl body. In fact, the railroad borrowed a CN SD50F to demonstrate the comfort cab design. This, of course, never happened, as the Santa Fe ended up with a fleet of GP60M hood units, along with their booster units. But what if there were a GP60F? Then it will probably look like an F59 PH painted in the red and silver war bonnet scheme. That would be awesome. Now, I don't have the time and experience to Photoshop a locomotive like this, but let me know your thoughts below. An O-scale F59 PH would be a perfect match for the bi-level Chicago gallery cars, or the Bombardier coaches made by Atlas and MTH, respectively. Number 7. GE-840CM, another Canadian cowl-bodied draper taper. It is essentially based on the well-received -840C hood units operating in the United States. Unlike the GMD versions that I already talked about, the C40-8M was built for not one or even two, but 3 railroads, all based in Canada. Those include Canadian National, BC Rail, and the Quebec, North Shore, and Labrador Railway. In addition to its fully enclosed body, the -8 was assembled with a pair of 6-wheel trucks manufactured by Dominion Foundries and Steel Company, aka Dofasco. As you can see, the brake cylinders are facing the same direction on each side of the Dofasco trucks, which were previously used on many MLW diesels. Even General Electric's AC4400CW prototype is fitted with the same style of side frames. In 2004, BC Rail was merged into CN, and the C40-8Ms were part of the acquisition. Sadly, about a decade later, all the former QNSL units were scrapped. While all the GMD Draper Tapers were retired by 2017, the Dash 8s continued their careers longer on the Canadian National than any other modern freight duty CAL unit until 2023. Fortunately, one C40-8M was placed on static display at the Alberta Railway Museum. Rapido has offered the Dash 840CM for HO and N scales. They look very well done, especially with railroad-specific details. I like the two pairs of working ditch lights in front of the BC Rail units. The lower pair are actually called rock lights. I would love it if these were installed on an O-gauge C40-8M, and maybe the nose-mounted classification lights could work too. Who knows? As I said before, Rapido is based in Canada, but there are also a few American model train brands that have made Canadian locomotives, like the aforementioned SD40-2F from Bowser, which is located in Pennsylvania. In fact, the real Dash 840CMs were assembled at the GE Locomotive Factory in Erie, also in Pennsylvania. Later in this video, I will give you another example of a Canadian model made by an American company. Number 8. EMD Standard Cab SD70. This locomotive has an interesting story, as it was Electromotive's final new build low-nose diesel in North America. After that, the wide-nose safety cab, like the one on the SD70M, became standard on all recent freight locomotives. Only 3 railroads bought the narrow-nose version: Norfolk Southern, Illinois Central, and Conrail. Initially, the latter did not intend to purchase the SD70 or even the AC traction SD70 Mac. In 1996, Conrail received 28 of the huge SD80 Mac units, as well as a couple of former EMD demonstrators the following year. The railroad considered ordering more of these 5,000 horsepower locomotives, but its plans were doomed by the merger efforts from NS and CSX. This forced Conrail to be the only railroad ending up with both the SD70 and SD70 Mac, which were built to the specifications of their respective purchasers. Interestingly, the blue standard cab units were assigned the same number class, the 2500 series, as Norfolk Southern's own units. This allowed a smoother transition to the NS roster without any renumbering upon the Conrail split of 1999. Meanwhile, the Illinois Central Railroad was absorbed by Canadian National, so some, if not all, of the former's SD70s had been repainted in CN colors. In 2018, Norfolk Southern began converting its low-nose units with new comfort cabs and AC traction motors. These are called SD70ACe-T4. Only 52 out of all 80 units had been rebuilt. That's exactly 65%. As of 2020, the remainder had been sold, or presumably scrapped. I should also mention that the SD70 resembles its predecessor, the SD60, but one noticeable difference is the truck design. The 60s were built with high-traction HTC trucks, whereas the 70s have the radial HTCR trucks. In a world of O-scale trains, the only SD70s we see are the wide cab versions, the most popular being the ACE. Yes, I'm talking HO again. There is the standard cab version made by Athearn, a very well-known American producer of HO and N-scale models. Of course, Athearn has offered the SD70 in prototypical liveries representing the 3 railroads that I mentioned, but there are also a few fantasy schemes like the Illinois Central Gulf and Rio Grande. Very cool. These are part of the Legendary Liveries product line. I wish the low-nose SD70s were done the same way in O-scale. Number 9. GE-940C, a low-nose diesel for Norfolk Southern, and the -944CWL, a Canadian-specific variant. In 1993, General Electric built the first -944CW as a demonstrator unit, which was later sold to the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. GE had no plan to build a narrow-nose variant alongside the wide-nose version until Norfolk Southern requested the 4,000 horsepower C40-9. NS was among the last railroads preferring standard cabs as well as DC traction. While most -9s were intended to produce 4,400 horsepower, NS chose to have its units rated at only 4,000 for fuel conservation reasons. All the C40-9s were delivered with roof-mounted air conditioning units, which led to their nickname, Top Hats. When compared to a -8, these are the only standard cab diesels riding on GE's high-adhesion trucks.
Now for the voice of experience. Yeah.
About 1 year after the Top Hats came out, Norfolk Southern became more convinced to purchase safety cab locomotives, the first of which was the -940CW, also rated at 4,000 horsepower. On the other hand, the Canadian C44-9WL has a 4-piece windshield and comfort cab resembling the aforementioned C40-8M, but of course the rest of its body is in the form of a conventional hood unit. Canadian National and BC Rail were the only buyers of this unique diesel. I could be wrong, but CN initially considered a -9 with a full-width body, just like the -8. This never happened, likely due to the cost of fabricating a cowl locomotive. Then again, the rear view visibility on the Draper Taper isn't quite as fully effective as on a hood unit. Ultimately, both CN and BC Rail gave up the 4-piece windshield design for subsequent locomotives, so the later -9s were built with a traditional 2-piece windshield. Instead of using the rectangular style as seen on their American counterparts, these units feature the teardrop or pork chop shaped windows for additional visibility. Even CN's early ES44 DCs rolled out of the factory with the same style. Beginning in 2015, Norfolk Southern has an ongoing rebuild program to convert virtually all of its -9s into the AC traction AC44 C6Ms. The railroad also upgraded the old units to the now standard 4,400 horsepower rating a couple of years prior. As of 2018, all the low-nose C40-9s were modernized with safety cabs and AC motors. This marked the end of GE standard cabs on the NS roster. Likewise, Canadian National received its first AC44 rebuilt from a late -9 in 2022. I'm not sure whether the older CWL units will be converted to AC, but I imagine that it's not impossible to do so unless a CN chooses to purge these locomotives from its roster. Back on the subject of O-gauge, we've seen scale models based on the popular wide cab -944CW, as well as its nearly identical 4,000 horsepower Norfolk Southern variant, but not the low-nose or the Canadian variants. For HO scale modelers, Athearn has offered the latter two types. So the -9CWL is another example of a Canadian model made by an American brand. I have also seen the NS C40-9 in both HO and N scales from another company called ScaleTrains.com. As with Electromotive's low-nose SD70, the C40 is a reminder to General Electric's final standard cab diesel available for US railroads. The C44WL is also a fine model when you consider its distinctive Canadian appearance. Both types represented additional variety within the GE-9 series and will always be remembered. Number 10. Motive Power Industries MPXpress series. We're now in the 21st century, and MPI, a division of Wabtec, designed one of the first passenger locomotives to comply with more stringent emission standards in the early 2000s. The two most popular types are the MP36PH-3C and MP40PH-3C. Now, I have seen a comprehensive video guide to the MPXpress locomotives uploaded by CoasterFan2105, so I would recommend watching it to learn more about them. For this video, let me briefly summarize their purposes. The first MPXpress locomotives were delivered to Metra in 2003 and were initially designated as MP36PH-3S, which used a static inverter driven by the main diesel engine to generate head-end power. In the same year, Caltrain was the first to receive a similar type called the MP36PH-3C, equipped with a Caterpillar head-end power diesel generator that is isolated from the prime mover. Both the S and C variants use the EMD-inspired 645 series engines to produce 3,600 horsepower. The latter turned out to be a better seller than the former, and it was built for quite a lot of commuter railroads: Metrolink, the Maryland Area MARC train, the Virginia Railway Express, you name it. Also included are some of the more recently established commuter rail services: New Mexico's Rail Runner, the Utah Transit Authority's Front Runner, and Minnesota's North Star. In 2007, MPI released a 4,000 horsepower version called the MP40PH-3C. By using the EMD 710 series prime mover, it can pull more commuter coaches without the need for another locomotive. The first customer of the MP40 was Go Transit, which previously had an average of 10 cars per train, as handled by the old 3,000 horsepower F59PH. But thanks to these new units, the number was increased to 12. The only other purchaser of the MP40 was the Seattle area Sound Transit. Other MPXpress variants include the Sunrail MP32PH-Q, rebuilt from former MARC GP40WH-2 units, and the Tier 4 emissions-compliant MP54AC, but I'm not going to cover them for this video. Both the MP36 and the MP40 were made for HO scale by a lesser-known company called True Line Trains. Atlas later bought the tooling. There is also an N-scale model of the MP36 by Kato, a Japanese-American brand. They do look accurately detailed, and you'll get a clear difference between the -3C and the -3S. The former has a rear roof vent for the head-end power engine, while the latter does not because of its static inverter. Maybe Atlas should do the MP36 and MP40 locomotives in O-scale with MTH's PS3 and DCS. The Metro units would perfectly match the gallery cars. The MPXpress diesels are really the pride of modern commuter rail across North America, and this is why they deserve to join the O-gauge world. Number 11. EMD SD70ACe-T4, the company's first freight locomotive to comply with the Environmental Protection Agency's Tier 4 emissions regulations, enforced on January 1st, 2015. Naturally, Progress Rail, a subsidiary of Caterpillar, wanted to upgrade the EMD 710 series diesel engine from Tier 3 to Tier 4, but this change proved unsuccessful, in part because of the two-cycle design. However, the company researched the old 4-cycle 265H engine, which propelled the 6,000 horsepower SD90 Mac back in the 1990s. The result was the 12-cylinder 1010J. Since Progress Rail was overdue with the Tier 4 engine, it wasn't until October of 2015 when the first SD70T4 demonstrator officially rolled out of the factory. 3 demo units were numbered 1501 to 1503 and painted in the same livery. Another 2 numbers, 1504 and 1505, were painted in Union Pacific colors, but with Locomotive logos. The following year, 10 more testbed units were outshopped. Numbers 1601 to 1602 and 1605 to 1610 also wore UP colors, while 1603 and 1604 are designated as the 4-motor SD70ACe-T4-T4, painted in BNSF schemes, but again with EMD logos. Beginning in early 2017, Union Pacific received the first production SD70T4s, as well as all the aforementioned demo units, except for number 1501 and the 2 P4 units. The next customers of the Tier 4 SD70s were expected to be BNSF and Norfolk Southern, but both decided to cancel their orders as of 2019. For that reason, those units that were completed prior to their respective cancellations were reassigned to Progress Rail's lease fleet. In the same year, though, CSX took delivery of 10 SD70T4s, numbered 8900 to 8909. The railroad dubbed them as ST70AH. They didn't stay on the property for many more years, as CSX had returned the units to Progress Rail after the lease ended in 2023. Presently, railroads have been skeptical about the EMD SD70ACe-T4, mostly due to its reliability issues. Even the more successful GE ET44AC can have its own flaws. Tier 4 locomotives are considerably expensive, so the alternative is to modernize or rebuild existing units. They have proven to be more economical and are exempt from the current emission standards nationwide. In the past several years, railroads have also purchased the so-called Tier 4 credit users that are identical to their Tier 3 predecessors, but that's another story. Despite all the skepticism, I personally think the EMD SD70T4 is not entirely that bad. I don't work for any railroad, and I can't say how much I like or dislike this locomotive. But as a rail fan, I still think it's very interesting, especially because the J engine is essentially a revision of the 265H that powered the SD90. There is currently no model of the SD70ACe-T4 for HO or any other model railroad scale. However, somebody cleverly made an Athearn product sheet to promote this locomotive for HO scale. Athearn officially announced on Facebook that this is entirely false. Yes, it is disappointing, but we must admit that the hobby is no stranger to misinformation. Anyway, there have been quite a few paint schemes applied to the SD70T4. EMD demonstrators, Union Pacific, CSX, and the lease fleet. But why not add some fantasy schemes to it? What if BNSF and Norfolk Southern received the Tier 4 EMDs? I got the idea from a product series called Hypotypical by Scale Trains. It represents a selection of realistically detailed models painted in whimsical what-if schemes. For example, I've seen some ET44 diesels wearing older liveries such as BNSF's Heritage 1 and CSX's Yellow Nose YN2. There's also a Canadian Pacific version even though Sepia never bought any Tier 4 GEVOs. Speaking of GE Tier 4s, I am excited to hear that Lionel will be offering the ET44 for the first time in O-scale. Up until now, they only made this engine as a semi-scale O-gauge product. I actually have the Union Pacific version in my collection. I would love to see more O-scale ET44s in fantasy schemes, just like the hypo-typical models. Same thing for the EMD SD70ACe-T4. And last but not least, number 12, EMD F125, another Tier 4 diesel from Progress Rail. It is the first EMD passenger locomotive since the F59 PHI, which ended production in late 2001. As more modern emission standards went into effect, the builder initially decided that it was too difficult and cost prohibitive to design a cleaner passenger diesel that would supplant the F59. This uncertainty lasted until 2013, when EMD officially announced a new 125 mph AC traction locomotive requested by Metrolink. Since Caterpillar acquired EMD in 2010, the prime mover for the F125 is a 20-cylinder CAT C175, producing up to 4,700 horsepower. So far, Metrolink is the only operator of 40 Tier 4 EMD passenger locomotives delivered between 2016 and 2021. Although it intended to replace the old F59s in Southern California, the F125 has suffered from technical problems similar to those on the freight-duty SD70ACe-T4. But as time goes on, it can be argued that these new units will become the mainstay of Metrolink and will certainly provide many years and millions of miles of service. While there are no scale models of the F125 at present, let's pretend that Lionel offers this locomotive for O-gauge. And what if the bi-level Hyundai Rotem commuter cars were also offered to go with the engine? I think the cab car should have not only the Lionel station sounds feature, but also the prototypical push-pull operation and a single press of the direction button on the Legacy remote. A few years ago, Lionel previously offered the F40 PH diesel and the non-powered control unit in the cab baggage configuration, aka the cabbage car. The NPCU is designed to be paired with a powered unit, so you can switch between ends of the train simultaneously with the direction. When both units face away from each other, the lights and sounds will activate depending on which way the train is about to go. The F40 and the cabbage car have their own switches labeled Unit Pair in order for the push-pull mode to work. So, let's apply the same thing for the F125 and the Hyundai cab car. I'm not sure whether the latter will have enough space to fit all those electronics without sacrificing the interior details, especially on the lower level. Station sounds are usually present on diner cars, where the kitchen portion houses this feature. Still, it would be realistic if the cab car has a unit pair switch to simulate the push-pull service of a commuter train. Of course, the only prototypical livery for an F125 is Metrolink. But again, let's consider some fantasy schemes. For starters, I have seen at least one piece of EMD concept art that was officially published before the first locomotive rolled out. That looks futuristic, doesn't it? Maybe a couple of other paint schemes can be the Progress Rail colors, as seen on the builder's website. I have even considered an F125 in the blue and burgundy colors of the Polar Express. After all, Lionel has made a lot of diesels in this fan-favorite movie scheme. The same paint schemes should also be applied to the Hyundai coaches, including the cab car. As I said before, I don't have the expertise to Photoshop a train, but let me know what you think. the F125 is certainly not a bad engine to make for O-scale. It's simply amazing. So there you have it, the top 12 diesel locomotives that deserve to become O-scale models. That was a lot of information to compile, and it was very challenging for me to decide which ones to list. But nevertheless, I've had a lot of fun making this video as entertaining and informative as possible. There is one locomotive that I always wish should become a traditional O-gauge engine, or semi-scale if you will. And the best pick is the GE AC6000CW, the most powerful diesel-electric locomotive in the world. Well, yes and no. Aside from the 6,000 horsepower 7HDL diesel engine, the most notable feature on this locomotive are the massive radiator wings with an overhang at the extreme rear. Both Lionel and MTH have offered the AC6000 as an O-scale model for years. I'm surprised that there hasn't been any semi-scale AC60 alongside the EMD SD90 Mac. The two O-gauge brands have made the 90 Mac in both Lionmaster and Rail King versions, respectively. While Lionel has not offered the SD70ACe or the ES44AC as semi-scale models, MTH has made the Rail King versions of both engines. What if the AC6000 were compressed into a toy? It'll probably be a Lionmaster model like the SD90, or it may approximately have the same length as the ET44AC, or it could be a Rail King Imperial product. Either way, the AC60 should definitely be offered in both prototypical and fictional schemes. Even this locomotive would look fantastic in a ready-to-run train set. Now, I could buy a full-scale AC6000 as an MTH Premier model at a reasonable price, but I think that would be a little bit too big for my layout. So, if any of you watchers work for Lionel or MTH, please consider making the semi-scale O-gauge AC6000. I will be more than likely to buy it. Seriously. I swear, it will be an awesome diesel. Don't get me wrong. And now it's time for La Rosa's Pick of the Month. Since I've been talking O-scale throughout this video, I think my best choice is sort of an amendment to my Toy Train reproductions video. This is a small Lionel catalog that is recently announcing the Vision Line J1E Hudson, a perfect choice for the company's upcoming 125th anniversary in 2025. I could be wrong, but I don't think it will be an exact reproduction of the 700E like the 2010 version. However, it will have a lot more prototypical features and details, such as a retooled boiler. I strongly believe that next year would never be a good celebration without Lionel's most iconic steam locomotive, the Hudson. Link to the catalog is in the description. If you'd like to support La Rosa's Trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through my Patreon page at patreon.com/LaRosasTrains. Patrons will receive exclusive benefits, which are all explained directly on this page. Link in the description. Your contribution, regardless of your preferred membership, is essential not only to me, but to the future of La Rosa's Trains. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can see what's coming up next from this channel. Anyway, that's all for now, and as always, thanks for watching. I'm Brian La Rosa, and I'll see you next time.